This is the Type Basics lecture for the beginning typography class. And in this lecture, I'm going to go over some of the very basic elements of typography and really set some foundational concepts for us as we're pursuing the rest of the information in this course. Because really to ensure that all of the information in this course is accessible, it's important that we cover some of these basic terms and concepts about typography and really the use of the written word. When we're dealing with typography, we're really dealing with the alphabet, and that most applies to the written word. So we need to really make sure that we understand the basics of how type is used and read and how we write. So here's an example of an uppercase alphabet. Here we're seeing the letters A through Z. This is in a condensed sans serif typeface. And we call typefaces that have multiple weights and styles type families. So oftentimes when we're looking at typefaces, they consist of multiple weights and styles. This is the typeface Tungsten from Hoffler. And what we're looking at here is a black, bold, semi-bold, and medium. So you're seeing these 4 different weights. These are all related in terms of their form. You can tell that they are very similar and designed by the same person with the intent of these being different varied weights of each other. So when we're looking at this, we call this a type family. And there may be 2 or 3 weights, but sometimes there's many weights. So here's an example of Sentinel, also from Hoffler. And we can see here the plethora of weights inside of this typeface. And here we also have the addition of italic. So that's another variation or weight that we will sometimes see. So typefaces have different number of weights and styles that make up these families, and sometimes that can really help us determine what typefaces we want to work with. Here's an up close of italic typography. This is something that is used often for emphasis or potentially for stylistic reasons, but oftentimes we use it for grammatical purposes when we're showcasing a quote or the title of a book or the title of a record or something of that nature. When we're talking about the alphabet and typography, we're also looking at different kinds of letter forms. So each of these glyphs or letter forms that you're seeing here are individual, but they fit into different sets. So here I've highlighted the uppercase letter forms. So those are actually the letter forms that are taller and bigger than their lowercase counterparts. So here's the lowercase. And then I'm showing in this typeface, which is Philosophia from Amigre, designed by Zuzana Litko, that this actually even has a unicase version. So there's even maybe a third case that we sometimes see. And you can see that in this set of letter forms, the upper and the lowercase letters are actually the same height. And that really allows them to be used in conjunction with each other, which we do mostly for stylistic purposes and branding and logos and things of that nature. But I just want to make sure that we all understand that they're upper and lowercase letter forms, and that there are different sets that go together into these typefaces. There's also even sometimes what we would call small caps. So I have those highlighted here. This is Mrs. Eves, also from Amigre. And you can see this beautiful set of small caps, which are the same height or approximately the same height as the lowercase letter forms, but they're actually capital letters. And these are something that we sometimes use when we're setting typography, especially when we're setting long blocks and paragraphs, and we don't want acronyms to stand out in the text. We'll use small caps to still keep those acronyms as capitals, but to allow them to fit better within the setting that we're working on. We also have the concept of a terminal. So a terminal is the ending of a stroke. So I'm highlighting these at the bottom of these R's, and you can see that in these different kinds of typefaces, there's different kinds of terminations to these strokes. So when we're discussing the terminations or the look of these parts of the letter forms, we're really looking at those ending strokes, which there are many within these letter forms. Typography is broken down into different kinds of classifications, so groupings of typefaces that have similar characteristics. So there's 5 basic classifications, but here we're looking at 6. So on the very left we have sans serif type. Sans serif typography doesn't have the little feet. There is no marker showcasing the termination of these strokes. As opposed to, second from the left, we have a serif typeface. Serif typefaces have these little feet or these terminations at the end of these strokes, and we refer to these terminations as serifs. So this is an example of a serif typeface. Then we have third from the left, which is actually still considered a serif typeface, but this is a modern. And you can see that high contrast in stroke. So here we're looking at these very thin horizontal strokes in juxtaposition to these very heavy vertical strokes. So this is a category within the serif category considered as a modern, or sometimes known as a dudone. Then we have fourth from the left is a slab serif typeface. So these also still have those feet or those terminating marks, but here you can see that they're enlarged, they're block-like, they're almost like a brick at the end of these strokes. And so that's a very characteristic aspect of a slab serif typeface. Then we have scripts, and scripts are really based on calligraphy or handwriting. And then on the very right, we have what we would call display type. And display type often could be considered to fit in some of these other categories. Like this, for example, is technically also a slab serif, but display type often is something that is reserved for headlines or large sizes. It's usually very exaggerated and playful. And so we call those things display type because they're really meant to be used for display purposes. So these are those classifications. And there are sub-classifications within each of these, but it's important that I think we set from the beginning understanding what these kinds of typography are. Another concept I want to cover here is the idea of width. One of the characteristics or variables that is played with when typefaces are designed are their width. So these can be all the way to something very narrow that we're looking at on the left, or something wider like what we're looking at on the very right, and everything in between. So when we're looking at typefaces that are on the left end of this spectrum, we oftentimes will refer to these as condensed. So condensed typefaces. Where on the far right, we sometimes refer to these as extended typefaces. So this is all talking about the general width of the letter forms within a specific typeface. And this is really showcasing the concept of contrast. And contrast is really the amount of variance that's there between the thinnest and the thickest strokes. So if we look at the sans serif typeface on the very left, we're noticing there's no contrast there, or very little contrast. For the most part, the stroke width there is consistent. Where in the middle, we start to see some contrast. There's a thinning in certain portions of these letter forms that is juxtaposed against these thicker portions of the letter forms. And then on the far right, which we looked at already, these very high contrast letter forms, where there's a large difference between the thinnest and the thickest strokes that are being shown there. So this is the concept of contrast. When we're talking about this in reference to typefaces, this is what we're really referring to, is what is the variance or the amount of contrast between the thickest and the thinnest strokes. And again, this is another variable that type designers can play with as they're designing typefaces. When we talk about typography, I think it's important to also talk a little bit about the structure of how we read and how we write. So when we're talking about text, first of all, we have words. Words make up the text that we read. So here I have the word seamless highlighted. We also have lines of text. So you can see here I've highlighted one line. So that is one continuous line of text. And that's really determined on how wide the line length is. Here we're looking at columns of text. There's 2 columns on this page. And that is one line that I've highlighted. We also have paragraphs. So when we write and read, we're looking at combinations of sentences and lines of text that make up paragraphs. And paragraphs are really divided by ideas or thoughts. So here I've highlighted an entire paragraph of this text. So I think it's important that we all understand these structures and how they work and how they're going to impact the way we talk about typography. There's also different ways to set text. So when we're setting copy, we can change a lot of aspects of how we set that copy that will affect how it looks. So this is about alignment. On the very left here, you'll see that we have this quote, and it all aligns on the left-hand side, and the right-hand side is ragged. So we call this left aligned, or sometimes we call it ragged right typography. So it's a way that we set text. So you can see how it all aligns there. Then we have the one in the center, and that's actually centered typography. So you can see that the alignment of these lines is all centered. And then we have on the very right, we have right aligned or ragged left typography. And you can see that the type is being lined up to that right-hand side. So these are 3 ways that we can set the alignment of type when we're setting larger blocks of copy. There's a 4th one as well, which is justified. And what justified will do is it stretches and moves the words so that there's an alignment on both sides. So you're seeing that all of these are aligned on the left and the right-hand side. We often see this in newspapers and some other publications, But then there's actually different ways to use the justified setting. On the very left, we have justified, but where the bottom line is left aligned. The middle one is a justified setting where that bottom line is centered. And then the very right is a full justified setting. That means that it's justifying every single line of text. So these are different alignments that we can work with within the justified setting.